Picture the Celtic homeland, misty Ireland, the Scottish Highlands, ancient druids standing under oak trees. That's the image almost everyone carries around without ever questioning it. Geneticists who have spent the last 5 years sequencing teeth and inner ear bone pulled from Iron Age burial mounds have found that this image is close to backwards. The ancestry now linked to Celtic culture doesn't radiate outward from Ireland the way the popular story goes. It arrives there, late, from somewhere else entirely. The scale of the evidence behind that claim is enormous. Thousands of ancient genomes now sequenced, a 2024 dynasty discovery unearthed in Germany, and a 2022 Nature paper that pushed the entire timeline back by centuries. So if the Celts weren't from the Celtic countries, where does that leave everything we thought we knew about who these people actually were? If ancient DNA rewriting entire civilizations is your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribe. This channel goes down these every week. The first place the old story breaks is the map itself. For over 2 centuries, the word Celtic has been tied to a specific patch of the Atlantic edge of Europe, a fringe of islands and peninsulas where the language supposedly survived longest and the identity supposedly ran deepest. That geographic anchor feels solid because it has been repeated so often, in textbooks, in tourism campaigns, in the branding of an entire cultural identity built around shamrocks and tartan. But anchors built on repetition aren't the same as anchors built on evidence. And the evidence, once scientists actually had the technology to extract and read DNA from skeletons 2,500 years old, told a very different story about where these people came from and when they got there. The mismatch between the story everyone knows and the story the bones tell isn't a small correction. It's a full reversal of direction, and it starts not with a single discovery but with over 100 years of argument among archaeologists who never had the tools to settle it themselves. That argument, and the moment technology finally caught up to it, is where this actually begins. The 19th century archaeological model, built from the Hallstatt salt mine site in Austria and the La Tene site in Switzerland, placed the origin of Celtic culture squarely in Central Europe, with influence radiating outward across the Iron Age landscape. For more than 100 years, 2 rival academic camps argued over the direction that radiation actually took, one favoring a Central European push, the other an Atlantic-facing spread. Neither side had a way to close the debate. Meanwhile, popular culture was busy doing something entirely different with the word. Kilts, Celtic knots, and the rise of Irish and Scottish nationalism collapsed all of that scholarly complexity into a single tidy identity by the 1800s, one where Celtic simply meant Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. That collapse wasn't ancient. It was a 19th century invention, the work of Romantic-era scholars who drew a tight, emotionally satisfying line between Celt and Ireland that the ancient world itself never drew. Go back to the actual ancient sources, the Greek and Roman writers who used the word first, and the picture looks nothing like a single ethnic group. They used Keltoi as a broad, often vague label, slapped onto barbarian peoples scattered across a huge swath of Europe, with no more precision than a modern writer using the word tribal. Archaeologists have understood for a long time that culture and genes don't have to move together, that a pot style or an art motif can spread through trade and imitation without a single person relocating. But understanding that in theory and proving it in a specific case are different things, and until ancient DNA sequencing matured, there was simply no way to test it directly against real skeletons in real graves. Then geneticists got hold of the bones, and the test finally became possible. Modern ancient DNA labs, places like the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig and Harvard Medical School's Reich Lab, don't work with bulk bone fragments the way older forensic methods did. They target 2 very specific sources, the petrous portion of the inner ear skull bone and tooth roots, both of which preserve genetic material far better than the rest of the skeleton. That precision is what made the Gretzinger et al. 2024 study possible, a project that used exactly this method on the Hochdorf and Asperg-Grafenbühl mounds, sequencing 31 individuals from burials dated between 616 and 200 BCE. These aren't obscure graves. They're the same mounds famous for some of the most lavish Iron Age grave goods ever recovered. Bronze couches, gold jewelry, imported Mediterranean drinking vessels, the kind of wealth that has long been assumed to mark out a distinct Celtic elite class. What genome sequencing adds that artifact analysis never could is kinship. Researchers can now determine direct biological relationships between skeletons buried a full century apart, something no amount of pottery comparison or metalwork analysis could ever establish on its own. This wasn't an isolated case study either. The 2019 Olalde study on Iberian remains, covering 271 ancient individuals, and the 2022 Patterson study on British remains, covering 793 individuals, applied that same core methodology at a much larger geographic scale. Taken together, these projects now represent thousands of individual ancient genomes, cross-referenced against each other in the largest dataset ever assembled to answer this exact question. Start with the two skeletons under Hochdorf's central mound, because that's where the first real surprise sits. The two most richly furnished burials in the Baden-Württemberg mound network, Hochdorf and Asperg-Grafenbühl, turned out to be genetically related. Based on their age at death and the DNA they shared, the relationship the research team identified as most likely was uncle and nephew. That single finding reframes how power worked in these societies. It wasn't a warrior meritocracy where status was won fresh each generation. It looks instead like inherited dynastic succession, a family line holding on to power across generations, passing wealth and status down through blood rather than combat or election. The team didn't stop at those two mounds. They also found genetic links connecting individuals to the older Magdalenenberg mound, built roughly a century earlier, revealing a kinship network that spanned multiple burial sites over 100 kilometers apart. And the ancestry of these elites wasn't locally rooted the way you'd expect from a self-contained regional dynasty. It traced primarily back to populations from present-day France, not to some static population that had always lived in southern Germany. A subset of individuals carried genetic markers linked to Italy, a detail that lines up neatly with the Mediterranean-style imported grave goods, the bronze vessels and wine-drinking equipment, found buried alongside them. The Celtic aristocracy of southern Germany wasn't a self-contained local dynasty. Its own DNA says it was partly French and partly connected to Italy, centuries before Rome ever conquered the region. That French connection isn't a coincidence. It's the same signal showing up 800 kilometers away, in Britain. Patterson and colleagues' 2022 Nature study sequenced 793 ancient individuals and identified a large-scale migration into Britain, occurring roughly between 1300 and 800 BCE, concentrated most heavily around 1000 to 875 BCE. These migrants, genetically linked to France, contributed approximately 50% of the ancestry of Iron Age people living in England and Wales. The critical detail sits in the timing. This population shift happened during the Middle to Late Bronze Age, centuries before Latin Celtic culture, the art style, the metalwork, the archaeological marker everyone points to as Celtic, even existed. In other words, the genetic foundation now credited with building Celtic Britain was already fully in place before anything resembling Celtic material culture had arrived on the island. The study frames this migration as a plausible vector for spreading early Celtic language into Britain, which does something important on its own. It separates the language question entirely from the culture question, treating them as two different processes that simply happen to overlap in time and geography, rather than one single event. And unlike the earlier near-total beaker replacement of the population before it, this Bronze Age shift was partial, roughly half of the ancestry pool, not a wholesale population turnover. But that half replacement was the second wave. The first one, centuries earlier, was nearly total. Around 2450 BCE, a new population associated with the beaker pottery complex arrived in Britain from the continent, and what happened next reshaped the entire genetic landscape of the island. Genomic data shows this population replaced somewhere between 90 and 100% of the existing Neolithic gene pool, the same people responsible for building Stonehenge, within only a few centuries. This wasn't gradual blending. It was closer to a total genetic reset. The incoming groups carried substantial steppe-derived ancestry, traceable ultimately back to the Yamnaya pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, thousands of kilometers to the east of Britain. One particular Y chromosome lineage, R1b-P312, and within it the more specific branch R1b-L21, became the overwhelmingly dominant male lineage across the entire British Isles from this point forward, a signature still visible in male lineages today. How a replacement this near total happened so fast remains debated. Some researchers have floated disease as one possible driver, the idea that continental migrants may have carried immunity to a plague that devastated the existing Neolithic population, clearing the way for rapid demographic turnover. That remains a hypothesis rather than settled fact, one theory among several still being tested against the genetic record. What isn't in dispute is the outcome. This beaker-descended population became the genetic bedrock that everything later labeled Celtic in Britain and Ireland was built on top of, and that bedrock was laid down more than 1,000 years before the word Celtic applies to anything in the archaeological record. The population most people picture when they imagine the ancient Celts of Britain was already genetically in place, a full millennium before Celtic culture, as archaeologists define it, ever existed. The DNA came first. The label came centuries later, attached retroactively to people whose ancestry had already been settled for generations. Ireland got hit by the same wave. Rathlin Island still carries the receipt. Cassidy and colleagues' 2016 PNAS study sequenced Bronze Age genomes from Rathlin Island, off the coast of Ireland, dated to approximately 2026 through 1534 BCE. What those genomes revealed was a sharp break from everything that came before. These individuals showed roughly 32% Yamnaya-derived steppe ancestry, a signal completely absent from the earlier Neolithic Ballinahadi genome, which carries no trace of that steppe input at all. The Y-DNA recovered from the Rathlin men matched R1b-L21, or its parent clade DF21, the exact same lineage that remains dominant across modern Irish populations today. The physical traits embedded in that DNA tell the same story. The Rathlin genomes carried blue-eye-associated alleles at frequencies that closely matched the modern Irish population, a striking contrast to the dark-eyed Neolithic predecessors who lived on the island before them. They also carried the C282Y hemochromatosis gene variant, a mutation that today occurs in Ireland at near-record global frequency, a genetic fingerprint that traces directly back to this specific Bronze Age population, rather than appearing later through some separate event. The scale of this ancestry replacement in Ireland tracks closely with what unfolded in Britain around the same period. This wasn't a small trickle of migrants arriving quietly over generations. It was a demographic reset, thorough enough to rewrite the eye color, the disease markers, and the paternal lineages of an entire island. Two separate regions now claimed as Celtic, Britain and Ireland, both trace their genetic foundation to the same Bronze Age steppe-linked wave, arriving centuries before Celtic culture existed in either place. That timing leaves an obvious problem sitting on the table. If the genes were already there that early, the actual starting point of Celtic identity has to be found somewhere else entirely. Archaeologists John Cock and Barry Cunliffe proposed an answer with what became known as Celtic from the West, the idea that Celtic language itself formed in Iberia and southwestern France during the Atlantic Bronze Age, somewhere between 3,300 and 2,700 years before present. Under this model, relatively undifferentiated Indo-European dialects entered Western Europe, carried along by the Bell-Beaker migrations, then slowly evolved into something recognizably Celtic through centuries of sustained contact along Atlantic maritime trade networks, the same networks linking Britain, Ireland, France, and Iberia together. The appeal of the theory is straightforward. It explains why Celtic languages survive today specifically along the Atlantic fringe, in Ireland, in Wales, in Brittany, and once in the Scottish Highlands, rather than surviving in Central Europe, where the archaeological markers of Celtic culture are actually strongest. It directly challenges the older assumption, the one baked into a century of textbooks, that language has to follow archaeological Celtic markers, like the Latin art style, wherever that style appears. Supporters point to extensive Bronze Age trade in bronze, gold, tin, salt, and amber, all moving through these same Atlantic-facing regions well before Iron Age Latin culture ever appears anywhere in the record, as evidence that these communities were connected long before anyone would call them Celtic. Critics push back hard on one specific weakness. The theory struggles to explain the heavy concentration of Celtic place names and river names scattered across Central Europe, and even further out into the Balkans and Anatolia, regions the Atlantic model has a much harder time accounting for. The rival camp puts the whole story back where the 19th century first drew it, in Central Europe. The traditional model ties Celtic origin to the Hallstatt culture, centered in Austria and dated to roughly 800 to 450 BCE, and its successor, the Latin culture, emerging from around 450 BCE onward, both firmly rooted in Central Europe rather than along the Atlantic coast. Under this model, Celtic language and culture spread outward from that Alpine and Central European heartland, moving west into Gaul, into Iberia, and into Britain, while simultaneously moving east into the Balkans and eventually reaching as far as Anatolia. The distribution of Latin material culture strongly overlaps with the historically attested range of Gaulish, the Celtic language spoken across ancient Gaul, a range stretching all the way from France to the Balkans. Supporters treat that overlap as solid evidence for linguistic and genetic continuity, a line running from the late Bronze Age Urnfield culture straight through Hallstatt and directly into Latin without a major break. But the picture isn't as clean as either side wants it to be. Patrick Sims-Williams's 2020 paper pointed out that neither the from the east model nor the from the west model fully survives contact with the classical written sources, since the surviving Greek and Roman texts simply don't cleanly support either simple arrow drawn across a map. Despite the disagreement, both camps now share common ground the older 20th century model never had. Population movement and language spread are not automatically the same event, and ancient DNA is now the only tool capable of separating the two apart with any real precision. In 2025, a study with more raw genomic firepower than either camp had ever had access to tried to settle the question for good. A 2025 bioRxiv preprint titled Tracing the Spread of Celtic Languages Using Ancient Genomics analyzed 4,587 imputed ancient genomes, by far the largest dataset ever applied to this specific question. The study zeroes in on a particular ancestry signal tied to the Central European Urnfield culture's Canovis subgroup, a signal forming roughly 4,000 to 3,200 years before present. From that origin point, the signal expands rapidly across much of Western Europe between approximately 3,200 and 2,800 years before present. Researchers traced it appearing in hallstatt context populations spread across France, Germany, and Austria, then reaching Britain by around 2,800 years before present, and finally reaching Iberia by around 2,500 years before present. A clear west-moving expansion with a fixed Central European starting line. The paper's authors state their conclusion directly. Their results support an Eastern Central European source for the spread of Celtic language, not the Atlantic beaker route proposed under the Celtic from the West model. Importantly, this finding doesn't erase the earlier Bronze Age beaker ancestry already sitting in Britain and Ireland, established centuries before. Instead, it identifies a second, later, and far more geographically specific signal, layered directly on top of that older foundation, one that lines up with the time frame when Celtic language most plausibly arrived. The largest ancient genome study ever run on this question lands on the side of the older, more traditional Central European model, after a full decade of newer theories trying to overturn it. The mainland absorbed that Central European signal fast, spreading across France, Germany, and Austria within a few centuries. Britain absorbed the same signal centuries later, and only partially, a slower, incomplete echo of what had already swept across the continent. The Gretzinger 2024 Hochdorf study's biggest implication isn't the family tree itself. It's what that family tree explains about how Celtic culture managed to spread across such enormous distances in the first place. Biological relatives ruling burial sites over 100 kilometers apart points toward political and marriage alliances among elites, not mass population replacement, as the actual mechanism carrying Latin art style and religious practice outward from one region to the next. This model directly answers a puzzle that had been sitting inside the DNA data all along. Culture and material style spread across huge distances during the Iron Age, yet the underlying general population in many of those regions never genetically turned over the way Bronze Age Britain did. Historical linguists have understood for a long time that language shift can happen without any genetic replacement at all. Modern Turkish speakers, for instance, are genetically overwhelmingly descended from ancient Anatolians, who spoke a completely different, non-Turkic language before the medieval Turkic migrations ever reached the region. That same decoupling logic applies directly to Celtic. A ruling elite's language and status symbols can spread through intermarriage and prestige alone, while everyday farmers 3 valleys over remain genetically identical to their grandparents, untouched by whatever political shift happened at the top. This explains why some regions, Britain and Ireland among them, show major ancestry shifts sitting underneath Celtic cultural material, while other regions may show Celtic-style burials and artifacts layered directly on top of largely unchanged local populations who never experienced a demographic reset at all. Iberia is the clearest test case for exactly this split. Olalde and colleagues' 2019 science study sequenced 271 ancient Iberian genomes, spanning roughly 8,000 years of the peninsula's history from deep prehistory into the historical period. In the specific Iron Age zone where Celtiberian language was spoken, individuals show around 60% ancestry linked to the so-called Germany beaker population, a substantial continental genetic signature layered directly onto the older Iberian substrate that had existed there for millennia. Y chromosome R1b dominates this Celtiberian zone sample set, consistent with the broader continental pattern already seen across Britain and Central Europe. The name Celtiberian exists for a specific reason. Both ancient writers and modern archaeologists recognize this population as a genuine fusion, Celtic-linked language and material culture layered directly onto native Iberian populations and their existing traditions, rather than a wholesale replacement of one group by another. Unlike Britain's near-total Bronze Age replacement, Iberia's Iron Age Celtic-linked ancestry looks far more like partial, layered admixture, supporting the elite network model rather than a not-total replacement scenario. The Celtiberians would go on to be remembered specifically for fighting Rome with the falcata, a distinctive curved sword that became one of the clearest historically attested Celtic warrior identities in the entire ancient Mediterranean world. A fighting reputation earned centuries after their genetic and cultural fusion had already taken shape. Now go as far from Ireland as Celtic ever reached, to central Turkey. In 279 BCE, Celtic-speaking tribes originating from Thrace and the Balkans invaded Anatolia and eventually settled in the highlands around what is now Ankara. The resulting territory, Galatia, existed as a distinct Celtic-speaking state from 280 to 64 BCE. A genuinely Celtic-identified population living over 2,000 kilometers from Ireland, further from the so-called Celtic fringe than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. Ancient Greek writers labeled these settlers Galatians, applying essentially the same broad Keltoi and Gallic framework used for populations scattered anywhere from Britain to the Balkans. Their capital, Ankara, sits at the geographic center of modern Turkey, about as far from the Celtic fringe image as it is possible to get on any map of Europe or Asia. Galatia later became famous for a very specific reason. The Apostle Paul addressed one of his New Testament letters directly to its inhabitants, a Celtic population living deep in Anatolia, still recognizable as culturally and linguistically distinct centuries after their original arrival in the region. This single case alone should break the assumption that Celtic means the British Isles. The ancient world's understanding of what counted as Celtic was never geographically narrow to begin with, and Galatia stands as living proof of just how far that identity actually traveled. Ireland itself isn't one genetic population either. It's a patchwork, and the DNA maps that patchwork block by block. The Insular Celtic Population Structure study applied a haplotype-based method called fine structure to modern Irish genome-wide data, breaking the population down at a level of detail no earlier study had managed. It identified 23 discrete genetic clusters within Ireland, each one tracking closely with geographic origin, confirming that Ireland is not one uniform Celtic genetic population, but a mosaic of regionally distinct groups. Genetic diversity between these clusters is most pronounced in the west of Ireland, while the east shows more erosion of that older structure, a pattern consistent with more historical contact and migration flowing through the eastern coast over centuries. When British populations were added into the same analysis, researchers found a clear west-east cline in Celtic British ancestry spanning both islands together, a gradient rather than a hard boundary separating one population from another. One particularly strong genetic-geographic correlation shows up between parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland, a link reflecting well-documented, much more recent historical migrations, not some echo of ancient Celtic settlement patterns. The takeaway sits plainly in the data itself. Even within the single most Celtic-identified country on Earth, ancient DNA shows layered, regionally distinct history rather than one unbroken ancestral population stretching back to the Iron Age. Zoom back out to the continent, and the written record turns out to have been arguing with itself the whole time. Bohemia, modern Czechia, gets its very name from the Boi, a Celtic tribe long assumed to be an original, indigenous Central European population, a detail that seemed to support the Celts from the East model all on its own. Sims-Williams's 2020 paper points out something that undercuts that assumption directly. No ancient author ever actually claims the Boi were native to Bohemia. Julius Caesar, in Gallic War 1.5, and Tacitus, in Germania 28, both describe the Boi crossing the Rhine and moving eastward into the region, meaning they arrived there from further west, not the other way around. Strabo's Geography, at 5.1.6, citing the earlier writer Posidonius, states that the Boi migrated from northeast Italy into the Danube region, where they lived alongside the Tarishi, another group Strabo identifies as Celtic in his own writing. This directly undercuts the idea of a stable, ancient, indigenous, Central European Celtic homeland that simply radiated outward in every direction. The sources describe movement into the region, arriving from Italy, not movement flowing out of it toward the rest of Europe. Even the textbook Eastern Heartland once checked against the actual ancient texts rather than the assumption built on top of them over 2 centuries of scholarship, turns out to be another layer of migration, not a fixed point of origin at all. Every version of the map, east, west, or somewhere in between, keeps hitting the same wall. Nothing about this population ever sat still. Antonio and colleagues' 2024 eLife study, Stable Population Structure in Europe Since the Iron Age, Despite High Mobility, set out to measure something specific. How much individual movement occurred across Iron Age and later Europe, compared against how much the overall population genetic structure actually shifted underneath that movement. The finding cuts against the intuitive assumption. Enormous levels of individual and small group mobility, traders crossing borders, soldiers stationed far from home, elite marriages linking distant families, artisans moving between regions for work, all coexisted with a surprisingly stable broad genetic structure across much of Europe, once the earlier Bronze Age upheavals had settled into place. This reconciles something that looks, on the surface, like a contradiction running through every other study in this story. Constant movement of people and ideas was happening at the individual level, without erasing the regional ancestry patterns sitting at the population level. This is the actual mechanism that lets Celtic spread as a cultural and linguistic label across thousands of kilometers, from Ireland all the way to Anatolia, while the underlying regional populations stayed comparatively distinct from one another the entire time. It's also the same mechanism explaining why Hochdorf's dynastic elites could carry French and Italian ancestry markers, while the wider farming population around them in Baden-Württemberg didn't necessarily shift in the same direction at all. High mobility and stable regional populations aren't a contradiction sitting inside the data. They're the same phenomenon, viewed at two different genetic scales, one looking at individuals and one looking at populations as a whole. Put every one of these studies side by side, and a specific mechanism starts to repeat itself across every single region. Bronze Age Britain and Ireland show a near-total ancestry replacement, the bell beaker wave sitting somewhere between 90 and 100%, arriving over 1,000 years before Celtic culture existed there in any form. Iron Age Central Europe tells a different story entirely. At Hochdorf, a small, mobile, intermarried elite class carried distinct French and Italian ancestry, sitting on top of a broader population, spreading culture through dynastic and marriage networks rather than through conquest or replacement. Iberia sits somewhere in between those two extremes, showing partial admixture, roughly 60% continental ancestry layered onto an older local substrate, producing a genuinely fused Celtiberian population and identity, rather than a clean replacement or a thin elite layer. Galatia shows yet another pattern again, a full-scale group migration of an already Celtic-identified population relocating wholesale into Anatolia in 279 BCE. A process closer to the Bronze Age Britain pattern than to the Hochdorf elite network pattern. Bohemia's Boy add one more variation to the list, another group migration, this time moving from Italy into Central Europe, undermining any lingering idea that one of these regions was ever a fixed original source point for everything else. No single mechanism, not mass replacement, not elite network spread, not partial admixture, explains all of Celtic Europe on its own. Different regions display genuinely different processes, all captured under one shared archaeological and linguistic label that flattens the differences between them. That's exactly why the word Celtic itself has become the hardest thing in this entire story to pin down genetically. No study in this entire body of research has identified a single genetic marker, haplogroup, or ancestry signature that defines what it means to be Celtic. R1b-L21 is common across Britain and Ireland, but it's a Bronze Age beaker-era lineage that predates Celtic culture by over 1,000 years. And it appears far outside Celtic-identified regions too, making it useless as a marker of Celtic identity specifically. The ancestry signal tied to Celtic language spread in the 2025 mega-study points to something different again, a Central European Urnfield and Genovese-linked signal, genetically distinct from, and arriving later than, the Bronze Age steppe ancestry already sitting in Britain and Ireland long before it. Celtic was, and remains, primarily a linguistic and cultural label, one applied by classical Greek and Roman writers to an enormous range of genetically distinct populations stretching from Anatolia all the way to Ireland. Modern commercial Celtic DNA ancestry tests compare customers against reference populations drawn from Hallstatt and tene-era archaeological sites. A genuine data set in its own right, but one describing a specific historical population rather than a fixed ethnic bloodline that exists today as a coherent category. The genuine discovery sitting across all of these studies isn't a single Celtic ancestry waiting to be found. It's a map of at least 4 or 5 genuinely distinct migration and admixture events, bundled together under one word, by people writing 2,000 years after most of those events had already happened. That leaves the actual open question, the one none of these papers can fully answer yet. Researchers still can't pin down the exact moment or mechanism by which Celtic language specifically, as opposed to art style or burial custom, actually moved between regions, since genomes show ancestry, not what language a given skeleton once spoke. The 2025 megastudy's Eastern Central European conclusion stands as the best supported model with the largest dataset assembled so far, but it directly contradicts Koch and Cunliffe's Celtic from the West model, and that debate hasn't fully closed among specialists working the problem. It remains genuinely unclear whether Ireland ever received a large-scale Iron Age migration at all, or whether Celtic language arrived there riding on the same kind of small elite network seen at Hochdorf, a process that would leave little genomic trace behind for researchers to find. New ancient genomes are being sequenced constantly, and the 4,587 genome 2025 study will almost certainly be superseded by an even larger dataset within a few years, the same way it superseded earlier, smaller studies before it. Every region covered across this story, Britain, Ireland, Germany, Iberia, Bohemia, Galatia, carries genuinely different, sometimes still debated evidence behind it, meaning the Celts may never resolve into one clean, single origin story at all. So the myth didn't just get corrected, it got replaced with something more complicated and more honest. The Celtic homeland people picture didn't generate the Celts, it received them, in layers, over roughly 2,000 years, arriving from at least 3 different directions. Bronze Age steppe ancestry built the genetic foundation in Britain and Ireland long before Celtic culture existed anywhere near either island. A later, distinct Central European signal likely carried Celtic language itself, arriving into populations that had already been settled for centuries. Elite networks, not mass migration, explain how Celtic style and language reached places like Hochdorf's dynasty and Iberia's Celtiberians, without any wholesale population replacement taking place. Galatia and the Boy prove the Celtic homeland was never fixed in the first place. It was always populations in motion, relabeled by outsiders looking for a simple story to tell about people more complicated than any single label could hold. If Celtic was never one people, one place, or one bloodline to begin with, what does the word actually mean to the millions of people still claiming it today?